This is a lesson on graphing sine and cosine functions. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we are going to graph sine and cosine by hand. So that's what we're going to do today. So what we're going to do to graph this by hand is when we have the sine and cosine function, we need to find the amplitude and period. Remember the period is 2 pi over b, so we need to figure out what that distance is. We're going to take that period and we're going to divide it into a fourth, and that's what we're going to count by. So we're going to divide that period to 4, because remember there are 4 sections that correspond to the 4 quadrants of on the coordinate graph. We're going to evaluate at each function. Is it going to be a positive amplitude, negative amplitude, or an intercept? Because those are the important parts of a sine and cosine graph. And then we're also going to mark our amplitude on the graph itself. So if we look, these numbers, I'll show you how to find these in just a little bit, but kind of looking at a graph in general, a sine graph starts at the origin, okay, and a normal sine graph starts going up. It goes, so it starts at the origin. The next line is going to be the positive amplitude, then it goes back to the x-intercept, then the negative amplitude, then back to the x-intercept. That's a normal sine graph. Notice that if either A or B are negative, it will flip the graph upside down. And notice the pattern. It goes x-intercept, positive amplitude, x-intercept, negative amplitude, positive x-intercept. The pattern continues, okay, as we go on. Let's look at cosine. Cosine starts at the amplitude. Cosine starts at the amplitude. And notice its pattern. It goes from amplitude, x-intercept, negative amplitude, x-intercept, positive amplitude. That's a regular cosine, starts at the positive amplitude. Now if A is negative, then it's going to be flipped upside down and it starts at the negative amplitude. Okay, let's graph these. So we're going to graph these by hand. So the graph paper, I have this on Schoology. This is the same graph paper that's going to be on the test. Okay, so that's why we want to use it. You can use your own graph paper if you choose. That works, but the graph paper that's going to be on the test looks exactly like this. So first thing I do, the line up there, I want to write down my equation, which is going to be cosine of 2/3 x. Okay, so I'll write that down. So there's my equation. Now my period, remember my period is 2 pi over b, so it's 2 pi. My b is 2/3. And remember when I divide by a fraction, I multiply by the reciprocal. The 2's cancel out, and 3 times pi is 3 pi. So there's my period. The amplitude, that's the number in front of cosine. There isn't a number, so I assume my amplitude is going to be 1. Phase shift, I haven't shown you yet. Midline shift, we're going to get to that later. We don't have one. And count by. This is how we do the count by. We take our period and we divide it by, or multiply it by a fourth. We take a fourth of 3 pi, or I just divide it by 4. So that's going to be 3 pi over 4. So that's my count by. So what I do next, I go ahead and mark my amplitude. I could go up 1 and down 1 on the graph, but that makes a very short graph and a very small graph. Let's use a little bit more of the graph. I'm just going to mark, notice there are no numbers on here, so I can make any line be what I want. So I'm going to have this be 1 and this be -1. Okay, I'm going to just make my graph just a little bit bigger so it can be seen a little bit on there. Then I count by. I know there's my origin, so that's 0. I count by 3 pi over 4. So that's my first line, 3 pi over 4. Then 3 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 6 pi over 4, and 6 pi over 4 reduces to 3 pi over 2. 6 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 9 pi over 4. 9 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 12 pi over 4, which reduces to 3 pi. 12 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 15 pi over 4. Notice I'm always counting by pi over 4. 15 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 18 pi over 4, which reduces to 9 pi over 2. Um, 18 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 21 pi over 4, and 21 pi over 4 doesn't reduce. 21 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 24 pi over 4, or I'm sorry, 21 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 is 24 pi over 4, which reduces to 6 pi. Now I have all my positive values. Now I can do my negative values because I just write the same numbers and I just make them negative. Easy enough. So let me do that real quick. Okay, make them all negative. Okay, so now I have my x-axis marked, I have my y-axis marked. Now I can start figuring out, okay, I have a cosine graph. Cosine graphs start at a regular cosine graph starts at the positive amplitude. This is a regular cosine graph, it's not flipped upside down, so I start at the positive amplitude. Now the pattern's always the same. I'm going to mark these dots. There's my positive amplitude. The next line is the x-axis. Next line, negative amplitude. Next line, x-axis. Positive amplitude, x-axis. Negative amplitude, x-axis. Positive amplitude. Let's do the other side. There's positive amplitude, x-axis. Negative amplitude, x-axis. Positive amplitude, x-axis. Negative amplitude, x-axis. Positive amplitude. Notice the pattern is always the same. You always use that pattern with sine and cosine. Positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, and so forth. Now I have these dots. Now I connect these dots with a curve. Another common mistake I have with people on tests is they make points. Remember, these are waves. These are waves. So make a wave. Don't make points. Make waves. Make your waves. I just make my waves. Connect all my dots with waves. There you go. There is graphing cosine by hand, that first graph. Let's do another one. We have negative 2 sine of 3x. So negative 2 sine of 3x. My period, well, my period is 2 pi over b, so it's 2 pi over 3. My amplitude, remember, is always positive, so my amplitude is 2. My phase shift, I haven't showed you phase shift yet. We don't have a midline shift. I'll show you that later. Count by. I take my period, and I take a fourth of my period, 2 pi over b. So I have 4 goes into 2, that's 2, 2 times 3, so it's going to be pi over 6. Okay, so I take a fourth of my period. So now I mark my amplitude. So I go up 2, down 2. Okay, there's my amplitude. I start at 0, and now I count by pi over 6. Now notice each time I'm counting by pi over 6. So pi over 6. 2 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 2. 4 pi over 6 reduces to 2 pi over 3. 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6 reduces to pi. 7 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6 reduces to 4 pi over 3. Okay, I have all my positive numbers. Now I just make my negative numbers. Just copy them down. Make my numbers negative. Okay, now I graph a sine graph. Sine graph starts at the origin, so I start at the origin. Okay, this one has a negative in front, so this one goes upside down. Normal sine graphs go up, but this one starts going down. So I have the x-axis negative amplitude, x-axis positive amplitude, x-axis negative amplitude, x-axis positive amplitude, x-axis. So here I went down this way, so I got to go up this way. So positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis. So there are my dots. Now I connect it with a wave. Notice my pattern was the same for sine and cosine. It's still that same pattern. Positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, and so forth. But I connect everything with a wave. So here's my wave. Make my sine graph with a wave. So there's my sine graph. Okay, let's do another one. So negative 3 cosine of pi x. So my period is 2 pi over b, which is pi. Pi's cancel out, left with 2. My amplitude is 3. Remember, it's always positive. My phase shift I haven't shown you yet. Midline, we haven't done that yet. Count by. I count by. I take 1/4 of my period, and 1/4 of 2 is 1/2. Okay, so my amplitude is 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I start at 0, and I count by half. 1/2, 1. 3 halves, 2. 5 halves, 3. 7 halves, 4. Now do the negative side. Make them all negative. Okay, so now I have cosine. Cosine starts at the amplitude, but because this has a negative amplitude, I start at the negative amplitude. Okay, now my process is the same. Negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude. Same on this side. There's negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude. So there's my dots. I connect everything with a wave. Connect all the dots with a wave. Make sure you go through the dots. Make your wave. And there's my cosine. Okay, keep going. going to do 4 sine of negative x. Now looking at this, I haven't had where I had a negative b before because, but let's see what happens. Well, let's rewrite this. I can take that negative, since it's sine, sine remember is odd, so I move the negative to the outside. I can rewrite this and make it negative 4 sine x. Okay? So if there's a negative on the inside, let's go ahead and just rewrite it. Make things a little easier on ourselves. So my period, well, b is 1, so it's going to be 2 pi. My amplitude, remember it's just going to be 4. There's no negatives for amplitude. Phase shift I haven't shown you yet. Midline shift haven't gotten to yet. That'll be the next problem. Count by. Well, we take 1/4 of 2 pi, and that is going to be pi over 2. So we count by pi over 2. So I mark my amplitude 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Start at 0. My amplitude is pi over 2. Pi over 2. Pi. 3 pi over 2. 2 pi. 5 pi over 2. 3 pi. 7 pi over 2. 4 pi. I do the same on this side. Make them all negative. Okay. Now, this is a sine graph. Sine graphs start at the origin. Now, this sine graph, it's flipped upside down because of the negative. So therefore, I go down. So I go to negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis. So I went down, so I got to go up this way. So positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis. So now I connect my dots to the wave. Okay, and there's my sine graph. Okay, let's do another one. Okay, this one, notice, is a little bit different. I have a negative on the inside and a negative on the outside. But because it's cosine, the negative on the inside, I can just drop because it's even. So I can rewrite it. So now let's go ahead and do my period. My period is 2 pi over b, so it's going to be 2 pi over 2, which is just going to be pi. My amplitude is 1/2. Excuse me. My phase shift, I haven't shown you phase shift yet, but I do have a midline shift. That is this number right here. That's my midline shift. That's the vertical shift that I have. So I do have a midline shift. And my midline shift is going to be 2. Okay, that means I go up 2. And I count by, I take 1/4 of pi, so that's going to be pi over 4. Okay, so I'm going to hold off on writing my amplitude right now. I'm going to do my x values first. So I have 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4 is pi, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4 is 2 pi. Same on this side, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, pi, 7 pi over 4, I'm sorry, 5 pi over 4, 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, 2 pi. Make them all negative. So now I have to do my midline shift. My midline shift is 2. So therefore, I'm going to go up 2. So 1, 2. Here's my midline shift. I'm going to use a highlighter to mark my midline shift. There's my midline shift. Okay, so I went up 2. Now, from there, my amplitude is 1/2. From my midline, I go up 1/2 and I go down 1/2 from my midline. Okay, so this will be here. It's going to be 2.5, and this is going to be 1.5. So that's my midline shift. Okay, so this is cosine. So I start at my amplitude. It's a negative cosine because there's a so I start at the negative amplitude, and now I just mark my dots. Negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude. So there are my dots. I connect my dots with the wave. And there is my cosine graph with the midline shift. Okay. And the last one was an exit slip. So let me show you the exit slip. It was 2 cosine of 1/4 x. So my period is 2 pi over 1/4, which is 2 pi times 4 over 1, which is 8 pi. My amplitude is 2. I don't have a phase shift. I don't have a midline shift. I count by, I take 1/4 of 8 pi. That's going to be 2 pi. So I have, since I don't have a midline shift, my amplitude is 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And I count by 2 pi, 2 pi, 4 pi, 6 pi, 8 pi, 10 pi, 12 pi, 14 pi, 16 pi. Make them all negative. Okay. This is cosine. So cosine starts at the amplitude. It's a regular cosine, so I start at the positive amplitude, x-axis, negative amplitude, x-axis, 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 positive amplitude. Connect the dots with a wave. And there is the exit slip. We did, there's the exit slip. These are the problems that we did in the book. Those are online, so you can look at those problems in the book and see those graphs online. So I already have those on Schoology for you. There's the exit slip that we did just a few minutes ago. And these are your extra practice. This is your homework. Okay, I have the graphs, the answers to those are already on Schoology also. So those are your homework problems. that I wanted you to do. You need to practice these graphs. There are 7 of them on the test. So you need to practice and do these. The only way to do it is by actually graphing. So do these on your own.